Ladies and gentlemen, people of all gender expressions, thank you for checking out the North Bank Media Podcast. I am your host, Patrick Strevens. Joining me on the show this afternoon was Rachelle Elsiufi. Now, she's a video journalist with CityNews here in Edmonton and contributor to the upcoming documentary VeraCity, in their own words. That documentary can be seen on Monday, February 22nd on CityNews, 10 p.m. Mountain, and I'll provide a link in the show notes for people to check that out. So really, as I said to her, and as I'm saying again, this is sort of part of the series of discussions I'm starting to undertake on systemic oppression and what that might mean, systemic racism, that sort of thing. And Rachelle's a great candidate because she herself has covered stories on racism and racist actions, and she has a lot of insight into these people, or I should say people on all sides of the issue, people generally. She's a journalist, right? So she came up against it pretty much face-to-face in Ponoka and then later in Red Deer in the fall of last year. And those stories are her contribution to that documentary. So she had a lot to say on that. She sort of gives a good historical background on what happened on those days in September. And then she, of course, was more than willing to talk about what solutions might look like and where these problems sort of stem from. Again, no one has all the answers in 1 hour. All the answers may never be so easy to apprehend, but it's conversations like this that we start and we listen and we try and take the ego out of it and get down to at least the heart of the matter insofar as we can see it. With that said, please enjoy my conversation with Rachelle Elsiufi. All right, Rachelle, thank you for making time. Really appreciate it.
No worries.
So I guess the background here was I put that post out on Instagram looking for someone to talk about systemic racism, and it was Rod, who we both know through work with City and other things, who suggested you. And so I guess I'm curious why would he think that you're someone who might have an interest in even having that discussion?
Well, I guess for the last few years, I've really been diving into the topic of racism, specifically at work, hearing stories of racism, people who were affected. And I recently worked on a documentary series with Rod. It's called VeraCity, in their own words, which focuses on systemic racism across the country. And it's actually going to air this Monday, February 22nd at 10 p.m. on City TV. So I'm very excited about that.
Nice.
So I'm really also, I'm looking forward to people watching and learning the experiences of BIPOC people or BIPOC Canadians and how they kind of differ across Canada, or how they're the same across Canada.
Sure.
My documentary focused on racism in central Alberta. And it took us a few weeks to actually find a topic.
Okay.
And I was really passionate about when I learned that I was working on the documentary because it was kind of right up my alley. But at first it was overwhelming because there's just so many stories of racism here in Alberta, here in Edmonton. So it was kind of tough to pick a topic.
Tough to pick one. That's kind of sad, isn't it?
Yeah. It's actually really sad. I had a whole list of angles and topics, and we eventually picked racism in central Alberta. And it was it was, I won't say it's a fluke, but it kind of it came to us because the week that we were deciding on the topic, Rod and I actually had to drive down to Ponoka, which is about an hour and 10 minutes south of Edmonton, because we were covering a news conference there. And just to give you background on why the news conference was happening was a few weeks prior to the news conference, there was this group. They're called Black and Indigenous Alliance. And they were protesting in the town of Ponoka and similar towns about, they're calling for racial equity in those towns. They've been protesting all summer since George Floyd.
Right.
Now, during one of their protests, one of their protesters were hit by a truck. It was like a hit and run. And they felt like RCMP were not taking the incident seriously enough.
Okay.
So that's why a few days later, they decided to hold this news conference in front of the steps of RCMP. So when we got to Ponoka, we were one of the first people there, and we were right in front of the RCMP detachment, and the group began setting up. And then all of a sudden we noticed more and more counter-protesters showing up. So just to give you an idea of who these people are. We recognize some of these people, because some of these people, we've seen them in the news in Calgary, we've seen them here in Edmonton, in Red Deer, like they do, they are part of some hate groups. Not all of them, I can't say all of them because I don't know all of them, but
right. Good.
A lot of them are part of hate groups and spew hate online. So we recognized a few of them.
Okay.
Part of groups such as Soldiers of Odin, I want to say Sons of Infidels, and like the Yellow Vest movement.
Right. Okay.
Just to give you an idea of who these people are. Now, when it came to the group beginning their news conference, they usually start with a land acknowledgement. These people were disrupting, and they weren't letting them have a word. Like they brought megaphones, they were yelling at them, interrupting their land acknowledgement. They wouldn't allow this group to speak. Like I was there, and even during one of the questions, I was asking questions, I couldn't hear the responses because they were so loud. So I kind of was trying to read their lips.
Sure.
And I was just like, okay, I think I got something, but I could not hear them. Like I could not hear their response, which was kind of sad because it was their news conference.
Right.
And then in one moment that I kind of just remember was one of the ladies who was leading the news conference. She's a Black woman who's actually from Blackfalds, which is kind of nearby. She was shaking a little bit, visibly upset. And when she would stumble a little bit, some of the counter-protesters, they were heckling her. And you could tell that she was upset, but she kept on going. She kept on answering the questions. She didn't let that kind of stop her. And I guess, okay, so now it's so much. There's just so much information. It's not like even just one moment in that conference. Because then after the news conference, everything is over. We interview the staff sergeant. I believe his name is Chris Smiley. Now, while we were conducting the interview, there were, before, cameras were on, there were two men on either side of me. And usually that means that it's like reporters or something, but it wasn't. These two guys were part of the counter-protesters. I'm pretty sure one of them, and I recognize both of them. One of them is part of a hate group. So typically when you begin an interview, just like when we began this podcast, you ask the person to say their first and last name. So that's and title. And that's exactly what I did. It's kind of almost like robotic, right? That's what you're going to ask them. Right. And he kind of refused to give me his first name.
Oh boy.
And I asked him again, because I'm like, maybe I missed that. No, he didn't. He just didn't give it to me. And I just felt like the energy was really negative there. So I was like, okay, move on. Like, I'm not gonna focus on this. I'll just Google him. I'm sure that his name will show up.
Sure.
And then, he didn't seem happy to, even be part of this interview, but it is what it is. My last question, I asked him why he couldn't move those counter-protesters. And I assumed the answer would be something like, the news conference was on public property. We can't do anything. Like, I don't know. I thought it was going to be something like that. I don't know. Instead, he says something. Oh, what did he say to me? He said, "Are you suggesting one side is more important than the other?" Because it's not. And when he said that, I remember I was shocked. And the two guys beside me, that's when they kind of celebrated after. You could tell they were really happy at how he conducted the interview, right? Sure. So after that whole event, we decided that we wanted to focus our doc on racism in Central Alberta. And we wanted Keisha Daniels, the one who was the speaker, the one who was shaking, but still, taking questions and showing her bravery. We wanted to interview her. Right on. And we wanted her to tell the story of racism in Central Alberta. We thought she would make a very, very good character. And that's how everything kind of sprung. And then everyone knows what happened in Red Deer, but that was all what happened 4 days before Red Deer.
Okay. So that's good to know. So the stuff that happened in Ponoka was before what went down in Red Deer?
Yeah. About 4 days.
About 4 days. Okay. Yeah, so you standing there as a journalist asking the RCMP officer, why didn't you do your duty, essentially? And his response is, well, both sides have a right to be here.
Yeah.
Now,
yeah.
In your mind, I'm thinking, you must be thinking, like, that's really not true because they were there to spread hate and to just, like, I guess I'm not trying to take a side here, but at what point, how far down that road was that cop correct in what he said versus, like, where's the line in your mind that, no, those guys actually didn't have a right to be there? Like, what is it they were doing?
Well, the thing is, he was saying, that everyone has a right to of expression. Mm-hmm. That's what he's basically saying. So he's trying to uphold both sides' rights.
Right.
And I think why so many people got angry with that, with what he said, was hate speech, racism. That doesn't get a side. That shouldn't get a side.
Right.
And so many people don't understand that hate speech is illegal. And saying that is illegal, and that's not free. You can't spew hate all you want, and that shouldn't be allowed. And I guess what a lot of people were upset about was this officer shouldn't be upholding their rights while not upholding the rights of the press conference. Because at the end of the day, like, I didn't hear, like, all my video, like, our mics were so great. Our CityNews mics were so great, so they were able to pick up on what they were saying, but when it came to even the video that I was shooting, like, for B-roll on my phone, I couldn't hear anything that this press conference was saying. So why uphold one group's rights who spew hate and then not uphold the other? And then, people also have a right to gather and protest.
Yeah.
That group wasn't allowed to do that. So their rights weren't,
right.
upheld. So I think when you look at it, I think that's why a lot of people were upset, and even me, I didn't expect that response. And I kind of, at first when that happened, I remember I came home and I was really upset. I didn't understand what he really said and why he would say it. And I was really hard on myself because I said, why didn't I challenge him on that? Like, what's wrong with me? Like, I'm not even doing my job. And I remember I was very upset for few weeks actually about that comment. This is before I even tweeted about it. And I remember my fiance was like, don't worry, like, you are in a spot where, you're the only person of color in this moment. And it was true. Like, I was shocked. And the other two guys on the side of me, they were also, I think they were live on Facebook or something. So it was one of those moments where you're like, I'm not welcomed, or I don't feel welcomed. I shouldn't say that. You don't feel welcomed. You feel like there's lots of hostility, and you kind of just want to get out of there.
No shit. It's not worth it.
I booked it right after. I was like, Rod, let's get out of here.
And that's their tactic. That's what they're counting on, right? Is that they're going to suppress, they're going to use fear, they're going to use intimidation, because they don't really have a leg to stand on. It's like, sure, come and express your views, but that wasn't even what they did. They came to suppress the discussion. We're not having a productive moment here at all, right? That's sad, though, to think that cop... So, was there fallout from that? Did that cop... Was he reprimanded? Did the Ponoka RCMP follow up on that? No.
Nothing.
Okay. All right. So, let's then... So, how much of the piece of the documentary that you contributed to is Ponoka, and how much is Red Deer? Or is it
I want to say it's half and half.
Okay.
Because what happened in Ponoka kind of was the narrative leading into Red Deer. And a lot of people didn't know that, because another reason why we decided to cover this story was we were the only media there. Okay, I think there was local media in Ponoka, but that was it. And like, media in Edmonton had covered when the protester was hit. So we got there early. Rod always likes to get to these news conferences early. You know him, an hour early. So we were there early, thinking that there would be a lot more cameras and a lot more reporters, and we were the only camera. So that was another point for us where we were like, this story isn't being covered enough. Like, people are just, I don't want to say they don't care, but they're just not covering it. So we kind of knew that it was our duty to do our documentary on this, and the people who have been protesting for weeks, all summer, and just how they were treated, and hear their side and hear their voices. So
right on. And that's that's the key. And if I could say, that's what I'm trying to do with this podcast now, is be less opinionated and more just allowing people to express their side of the story. It's not my job, and as a journalist, it's not always your job to pass a moral judgment on these things, but you have to express the facts that are happening, right? First.
Yeah, first and foremost.
So let's go to Red Deer then. It was, my notes say September 20th was that same alliance was going to start a protest, or not even a protest, but just a demonstration, right?
They just wanted to have a talk about anti-racism.
Let's talk. That seems reasonable, hey?
Let's just have a talk with a few people. I won't say a few people. Dozen
How many?
people.
A dozen? Okay.
A few dozen. They were just having a talk on racism, anti-racism. They were also with a few other anti-racism groups.
Okay.
And before they even could get there, like before they could even set up, they were like arriving at the park, setting up. And like Keisha Daniels, when I spoke with her, she said that, before she even began setting up, counter-protesters arrived. And when you saw the video, like the raw footage, you can see, some these counter-protesters, these grown men, leaving their vehicles, and they're angry and they're pushing people. Some were like punching people. I saw two punches. I saw so many pushes. And when I spoke to Keisha Daniels the day after, she was very, very upset. She said she was traumatized. These are grown men charging at them, yelling racial slurs.
Wow.
And all she wanted to do with her group was talk about racism. They weren't even, like, we kind of called it a protest, but it actually, like, it wasn't. It wasn't like they were, they're yelling anything. They were just having a community discussion. And it was really sad. So out of fear, they said that the counter-protesters, there was actually more of them than the anti-racism groups. So out of fear, some backstory, sorry,
sure.
should have added this.
Go ahead.
But so there's been 4 or 5 days between the Ponoka incident and the Red Deer incident.
Okay.
So there have been a lot of threats to this group. I know, crazy. Why would people be threatening an anti-racism group?
Well, we can talk about that.
Well, it was really sad. I saw lots of these threats because they would send them to me, and they were threatening them. They were threatening they were going to come and drive-by shootings, stuff like that.
Yeah.
I don't know how serious these threats were, like really, but at the end of the day, you're threatening people's family. You're threatening their lives. It's terrifying. So when they get there and they see these people and they don't know who's been threatening them, it's terrifying. And they see these punches thrown and they feel like RCMP aren't going to keep them safe. They don't want to be there. So they canceled the event, which was really sad. And we did the story. And I don't think anyone else did the story. So our story just happened to go viral on Twitter.
Right.
And the next day, Alberta's Justice Minister ordered a criminal investigation into what happened. And RCMP, the same day, held a press conference to talk about what happened. And they said, we're investigating all of this. And I remember one of my questions was, well, yesterday I did this story and I talked to RCMP. They told me there was no investigations. And when I ask people questions, if I'm like unsure of their response or anything, like I ask them the same question several times.
Sure.
So I'd be like, are you sure there's no investigations? Like there's no investigation like concerning the violence, like the violence, or how I worded it. I can't really remember,
Sure.
but she basically told me, there's no investigations whatsoever. And then it was a different story the next day. He said, we have been investigating. We were investigating the entire time, even when, let's say, we heard there was a punch thrown.
Right.
We investigated it then and there. And then I was like, well, then why didn't you throw that guy out? Because we have video. We have video of the same guy punching another guy. So it's kind of like, I don't know. I don't know why nothing was done there. And the story just keeps on changing. So
Right. So do you have a sense of what that is? Is it incompetence, or is it something deeper, like there's some racism at the leadership positions of like?
Well, from what I've been told from BIPOC people and listening to them, they feel that sometimes police or RCMP in those situations can take a side because, well, when I spoke to experts, it's one of those situations where it's like one group is calling for defunding police. So maybe that could be something.
Right.
And then the other group can sometimes be really buddy with police, right?
Right. I saw that interview you did with the guy from McEwen, Irfan, I think is his name.
Yes.
And he made that point. He's like, I would hate to think that but that's the problem is like those people in that park aren't necessarily calling for defunding the police, but we've decided to lump everybody on the left as that and everybody on the right as white supremacist wackos.
Mm-hmm. Well, it was interesting because, you see what happened in Red Deer during that violent protest. And then a couple weeks later, same group holds another protest in Red Deer, this same area. And this time it's very different. So you have to ask, why is this any different this time? Is it because there's a lot more national media attention this time?
Interesting.
Because when I went to that protest, there was barricades around the park. They had helicopters, drones, streets were closed.
Really?
We actually had a tough time getting to the park because there was a lot of street closures. There were police officers everywhere. So barricades, and counter protesters were not allowed to get into the park, into the barricades.
I see.
But they did also hold their own barbecue just outside the barricade.
Okay, can I stop? Because I love that. It was like this, whatever they call it, supremacist march or patriot march and barbecue. I was like,
yeah,
there's some kind of, well, that's funny in some way to me.
Yeah, they held the barbecue.
That's also, get some food before we go spreading our hate,
Yeah, and it's like, I've heard their interviews and they say things like, we had planned this barbecue earlier before. No, why are you holding it the same day people are, protesting protesting racism?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, but you could tell, police would remove these counter protesters anytime they tried to step in through the barricades, because they tried several times because they wanted to get in.
Right.
And police would turn them around. And then when the group was marching, police made sure that these counter protesters stayed away, and they would have even a human barricade to make sure that stay on this side while they marched. So that was really good.
So would you say the police response to this second event was adequate? Was at least made a difference?
Well, yeah. When I spoke to Keisha Daniels, who's kind of the main organizer, she said that police did their job this time.
Okay, that's fair. So what's kind of been the fallout from that? I kind of cruised the CityNews website searching the keyword Red Deer, and it kind of seems like after a certain point, there wasn't much more to cover on that. That guy that threw the first sucker punch, he actually was charged, was he not?
Oh, yeah, he was charged. He's facing 2 charges because he threw 2 punches. I think it's before the courts now. I don't know if he's gone to court yet.
Okay, no problems.
But it's before the courts right now.
So, right. Clearly, obviously, the hate probably hasn't gone anywhere, but there's no flaring up these days. There's nothing major recently?
Not recently that we've covered. I'm sure it's out there.
Right. Because we spoke about that one activist, I believe her name is Taylor McNally. Mm-hmm. I might be getting 2 things confused, because they went to another small town recently because there was a guy with the KKK hood on his...
Yes, Grimshaw. They went to Grimshaw. Forgot about that one.
But did she also protest at another hearing? Sorry, and this is kind of into the weeds, but I'm trying to see if there was any fallout from what did happen in Red Deer, or if it's kind of just is out of the news cycle, so to speak.
I think it's been out of the news cycle right now. The group is still working a lot behind the scenes. I don't think there have been a lot of, let's say, protests, but yeah, they've traveled to Grimshaw in Alberta when a guy was spotted with the KKK hood. They went there just to protest. And actually, I think some of the members you will probably see them later today around 3:00.
Right. Yeah, I'm going into the rats, or the snake's nest, or whatever you want to say, I guess, apparently. So
yeah.
Yeah. Okay, how about that? What would you say to me and that reporter that are going to this today? What's our responsibility? Like, what is the media responsibility at this point?
Well, I think it's to cover what happened, I guess. I think our job as the media is to cover what is happening in that moment. And everyone always says, you always have to be fair. Of course you have to be fair, and you always have to try and get, both sides. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, there's no sides to racism. So I hate when, even when I was doing my stories and my coverage, and people who were part of these hate groups would say, well, it's not fair. You didn't speak to the white supremacists. Why would I speak to this white supremacist about why he's protesting an anti-racism rally? You know what I mean? Like, I think we have a duty to tell these stories, but also to represent BIPOC people and to represent them accurately and why they're there. So instead of, basically I've seen so many media reports who will, report on something similar to this story. I haven't really been into the weeds in this story, but who will report on a protest being organized by hate groups, and they don't say that. They just say a protest was happening here, but they won't call these hate groups out for what they are. Or if there was a racist rant, and we're all doing the story, every media in the city is doing the story on this racist rant. Headlines will be like controversial incident.
Right.
Why aren't we calling it racist? It's a racist rant. He was saying racist things. And I feel like all of us, including myself, across Canada, North America, we could be doing a better job to call things out on what they are, or do your research. I've seen reporters say, well, I wasn't sure that was a hate group. Well, then quickly do your research. Not hard to find out that he has ties to, Sons of Odin. It's not hard. And when we don't report the facts or don't call groups out for what they are, I feel like that emboldens these hate groups, because they think we can do whatever we want. No media is going to call us out for spewing a little hate here and there. Mm-hmm. And then, you call something racist. There's still some shame with that.
Yep.
People know that. Even the people who are racist, they know that being racist is shameful. So they'll always try and weasel their way out of it, right?
Yes. And that's the key. That's the key, isn't it? Is to get all your facts, get as much information as you can before you go passing a judgment on any of it.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I would like to ask you about, do you just is it like kind of between you and other reporters, is it that you would never speak to these white supremacists as soon as you could indicate that, this guy's part of a hate group, he's spewing hate, now his views are actually totally invalid? Is that pretty much accepted?
Speak to them, but why would I err and give a white supremacist a platform? Because at the end of the day, if you really think about that, if you keep doing stuff like that, if you first of all, you validate what they're saying.
Right.
You're giving them airtime, and you're emboldening him and his hate groups to uphold hate, intolerance, and white supremacy.
Right. Right. No,
So why would you do that? And I know it's kind of a tough decision, and a lot of people don't understand that, and they think, okay, I need to make this fair. I need to get both sides.
Right.
But is that both sides? Racism shouldn't have a side.
No, certainly hate doesn't have two sides, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. It's tough. I don't envy you sometimes choosing how to tell the story, right?
Because there's always going to be like someone angry with however you tell the story. There's always going to be some backlash somewhere. But I think as the media, we play a big role in changing the narrative of about how we, tell these stories. And if we could be doing a better job.
Is that right?
All of us. Yeah.
Okay.
Myself included.
Sure.
We all could just be doing such a better job. A better job of even, including BIPOC people and representing them in our stories. So many times, like right now it's Black History Month. So I know a lot of people are focusing on Black voices, but that should be kind of the norm the rest of the year.
Well, you shouldn't need a month, right?
Exactly. There shouldn't just be 1 month that, we're all like, oh, let's do this story on Black businesses. Let's focus on this. It should kind of be the norm. We should,
yes.
When our experts, from our experts to our streeters, so the people man on the street, the people that we just talked to, I think we need to focus on getting diverse people all the time in our news stories, because it better reflects the country that we are. And it also breaks that norm that white voices are the standard and that white people are supposed to dominate the conversation.
Is that something you've encountered? Is that a deeply held, because I'm white people as the standard, white people as the dominant. Is that something that you've run up against personally, where it's like you talk to a white person, say, and you can just tell that they're not seeing eye to eye with you. They're not taking you seriously. I mean,
yeah, so many times.
Sure.
Even me, like I'm a person of color, and like I've had my long history of racism. Maybe it's not as overt
Sure.
as other people, but yeah, I've experienced it myself. And if I share my stories, sometimes people don't understand, or they'll say, well, I've had a hard time in my life, and they don't understand. I guess the term really became big this last year is white privilege, and what white privilege means.
Sure.
And a lot of people think, when you say, oh, well, you're a white person, you have white privilege, they think that, I guess privilege might be kind of a confusing term, because they think, well, I was poor. I had nothing. I didn't have a privileged life. Like I had to work for everything. True. However, your skin color was never a barrier for you. And they don't understand that, because it's a lack of education at the end of the day. I don't think a lot of people have, I think people may be racist, but don't have that hate. I think it's all just based on ignorance. And
Sure.
I can talk about that for like hours right now, why people are like that, but I guess we don't have the time.
If you're enjoying this conversation, please subscribe on YouTube and give us a like. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please subscribe and leave a 5-star review. And now, back to the conversation. Oh, I hope we do have the time sometime. I'm trying to have this discussion more and more. And I don't know why, but I can't seem to stop myself. So if
That's good, though. It's good that you have those questions and are seeking, to find those answers by
Thanks.
talking to people. Because I do think that is one of, that's how, when you say, how do we stop all this hate? I think one of the ways is just listening to BIPOC people. BIPOC people tell their stories, their history. Just listen, yeah.
Just shut up and listen.
Just shut up and listen. Let me talk for
I know.
the next hour. No, but I think that is important, because I think so many times we always want to compare ourselves to what that person experienced. And it's like,
yes,
at the end of the day, you can't do that. It's like, I'm a mixed woman. I've experienced racism throughout my life, but it would be so ignorant of me to compare my lived experiences with an Indigenous person.
Sure.
Or a Black person. Like, they all have had such different, more overt, I would say, experiences with racism. So I can't say, yeah, I've experienced it too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's learning for so many people. And I think it also has to do with, I guess, our education system. I think our education system in Canada, everywhere, has failed us, because, like, think about your history classes or what you learned in school. And I'm thinking I kind of learned about residential schools, but it was definitely like glossed over.
Yeah.
Like, what did you take away from school?
Honestly, I feel like there was so much time spent studying other nations, Russia, China, you name it, right? And sure, that's important. World War II, obviously, we have to understand all of that, but to not even touch on what could be classified as a genocide, if not a major cultural sort of war.
It was a genocide. It was a genocide, and I don't
Call it
think
what it is.
Those words were even.
Ever
I
used.
can't remember.
No.
I can't remember, but I'm like pretty sure those words were never used when describing our Indigenous people. It was very glossed over, and I think that's one of the reasons why people don't understand right now what intergenerational trauma is and what they're going through, and there's no compassion or sympathy because so many people are ignorant. Like, I remember we really focusing on Germany, the Nazis. I remember we had to read Anne Frank's diary, which is all important. Don't get me wrong. That's important. But I just remember that takeaway, right? But like, why couldn't we read something about our Indigenous people suffering? You know what I mean? Like, why wasn't that a mandatory course?
I'd love to know. Maybe that's a story you could do if you're interested in sewering your career. Ask some of these school boards how they choose their curriculums. Push them,
There have been a lot of actually people, and I have done a few stories here in Alberta where it's kind of almost the same thing where Black history has kind of been, I won't say erased, but necessarily not all Black history is in the history books here in Alberta. And a lot of the people I've spoken to, their ancestors had come from Oklahoma into Alberta back in the early 1900s, escaping Jim Crow and segregation. And they traveled all the way to Amber Valley. They helped build up this province from the ground up.
Right.
So they've been here for hundreds of years, and they still get people say to them, go back to your own country.
I was here first, buddy.
Exactly. But lots of people don't know that.
I'd forgotten about that. But yeah, there's a whole community of Black, like generations of them now who came to Alberta.
Generations. Yeah. Lots of people I've spoke to, their ancestors had come here in the early 1900s. So, and they're out, and then, they're out protesting still.
Yeah. Who's the real Albertan at that point? You almost would have to ask. I really like what you said about white privilege, about maybe the first thing that white people could do when it comes to that is just take their ego out of it and just be like, okay, your skin color has not prevented you from really anything. That's not an attack on you. It's really not even your fault in a sense.
Yeah.
Stop. And the other thing too is like saying, well, if somebody other than you had a traumatic, terrible experience because of, that doesn't somehow negate anything that ever happened to you. There's not a finite amount of experience and identity. We've all suffered, and we've all suffered in different ways. The big thing that I've learned in the last few weeks is just to stop making it about me and just shut up and listen and try and hear as much as I can before passing any kind of a judgment.
Yeah. And that's good. I think that we all can, every single one of us can do that, and we can learn and understand. And there's something, what's it called? I think it's called white fragility now, where...
Oh, yes. We're privileged and fragile. Just give us a little bit of time. We're getting there,
But it's the concept that, and it's all based out of ignorance, but it's kind of like a good example, I guess, of that. I don't know if you heard about it, but was it this week? A school in Edmonton, a high school student created this Instagram account. Oh. It's called something White Alliance.
White Student Alliance.
White Student Alliance.
I was going to ask you about this, so please, go ahead.
So basically, it was to fight against anti-white racism and Black supremacy. And basically, this student, wrote out this long thing about how white people are being targeted and blamed for their ancestors and what they did, etc. And it was very sad. And when I actually spoke to an expert about that, he basically told me, it stems from ignorance. So
Yes.
first of all, there is one silver lining there, because it shows that racism is being talked about in schools right now. It is, right?
Sure.
Maybe more so than ever before, right? So that's why this kid is obviously confused. Then the expert also said, it's difficult because these kids are learning about racism maybe for the first time in their lives in school, in high school, let's say.
Sure.
Or, and I spoke to a university prof, he said he's seen that in his classrooms as well. The first time you're learning about racism is in a university class or in high school. So of course it's very, you feel like it's just an attack on your people,
right,
in a sense, right?
Right.
Which it's not, but you don't get that historical context at all. Mm-hmm. So all you're hearing is, my group is like this and this and this and this, and I've had a hard time. Why are they saying that I have white privilege?
Right.
So they don't get that historical context from earlier on in their lives, and then they just hear maybe snippets about, this and that, and that's, I think, another reason why we're seeing some of these things online. And it's a kid, right? You can't say that this kid is racist, but
he's not figured it out quite yet.
He doesn't get it, right? It's ignorance, and he doesn't get it.
Right. So do you find that's where a lot of this comes from, is just ignorance, like the opposite of what I was saying, the refusal to listen to other people's voices and just to go ahead with your own?
Yeah, and that's ignorance, right?
Yeah.
That's ignorance. But I also think our social media right now is playing such a big part in that, because, they don't, lots of these people, they refuse to listen to BIPOC people, and they, are scared. They don't understand. They don't have the historical context. They don't want to hear the historical context. And it's also like, where are they going to get this historical context? They don't know where to look.
Yeah, not the schools, apparently.
Exactly. So if they're friends with people who have similar views on Facebook, that's all they see. That's all they see all the time. And sometimes there's some, very hateful things out there, and it gets them angry, and misinformation.
Right. And it's unfortunate, because in some ways they themselves are internalizing a feeling of victimization, which that goes on all races, It's that, to me, isn't productive either. It's like this guy who wrote this, and I was just looking at the page. It's a lot of like low level. It looks like it was written by a high schooler, but he's now taking on this feeling of somehow being victimized because of his skin color. Mm-hmm. That, to me, is not productive at all, to tell someone that they are a victim because of something they can't change. What do you think about that approach?
Well, it was interesting listening to, when I read his piece, because when I was even speaking to some experts, it was very similar language to what we've been hearing before.
Okay.
Based on ignorance, it's based on, fear, that that people are hating you for. Thing is, there's no such thing as white people. There's no such thing as Black supremacy, because Black people are not. Systemic racism has to do with, institutional power. And one of the institutional power is one of the, what word I'm looking here for? I'm just talking around the circle.
No problem.
But it has to do with institutional racism as well. So that's why Black people are not in power, let's say, right? So that's why there is no such thing as Black supremacy. And then on the other hand, so when he says, he's fighting, there's just no such thing.
Well, there could be, there's definitely nowhere where it's really inaction, where Black people are keeping white people, or people of color are trampling on white people through institutional power. Definitely not here anyway, right? But what has been kind of the public reaction to that? Like, is anybody saying, like, is everyone just shitting on this kid, or is anybody actually thinking this kid has got it wrong, but at least he wants to talk? He's not seeing it clearly, but can we find in there a kernel of some product of, here's a young person here's an opportunity to change this guy. actually.
And I think maybe that might be the way the school might be taking it. They couldn't give us details. Like they said there's an investigation,
Okay.
but they couldn't give us details about what that investigation is going to look like. So he's a kid. I don't think he's going to get charged or anything. I think it's going to be education.
Good.
Even the school was kind of like, this means that we need more education on anti-racism in our schools. So I think they're going to fight the racism with education. And I think that's probably that's a good way they can do it because the kid's in school, right?
Yeah. I mean, he's there to learn.
Exactly.
Right on. Do you see social media generally as being part of you said almost it's part of the problem because it allows like radical ideas to spread in a necessarily like condensed form. You know, it's almost like the fast food of ideas. It's like, whereas the podcast here, we can string out ideas all day long and really get down to the...
But you have white supremacists on podcasts. You have them doing live videos or videos on YouTube, on Facebook.
Sure.
Sometimes on Facebook, they can get reported. So then they can't go live or on Facebook jail. So they can't go live for a month or something. But their videos will still pop up.
Sure.
They're still doing YouTube videos. They're still spewing hate, misinformation. And sometimes they are under the disguise of something else, right? They are pretending to fight for, right now it's COVID, right? So they are under the disguise of, we are fighting for our freedoms. We don't want things to be shut down. We don't want to wear masks. We don't believe COVID is real.
Right. So it's almost like a melting pot of what you would call, it's fundamentally kind of conservative worldview, right? You know, like one skin color, small tribes, you know, keep the government influence out, keep people
far right.
Yeah, certainly. Far right. But okay, all right. Are there inroads to be made there where you like, maybe I've asked you this enough and you just don't want to answer. What is there, like, obviously some people, we're not going to redeem them. They're just, I mean, like that guy who put his tablet up in that one story to show that, in your story where there's the guy and he's showing on his tablet how he's going to beat up somebody much smaller than him, like that guy's probably not redeemable, right? But are there inroads to be made in those communities, or is like, at what point do we just cut them off and quarantine them?
I've definitely heard stories about people who used to be a white supremacist, right, and who have experienced something that changed their view on society.
Okay.
So I have heard stories about that. I don't think everyone could fall into that, but I think that lots of people are just so ignorant, and that if they get education, if they let BIPOC people talk to them, hear their stories, I think they could change 100%.
Yeah, good.
I feel like the hate is misunderstood and misplaced, in fact. So
yes.
I just don't think they understand, you know, they see somebody of different color, let's say, and sometimes they think, oh, that person's taking my job, but they don't understand. And there's so much misinformation out there. They just don't get it. It's like right now, a lot of people from one side is calling the anti-racism protesters, they call them Antifa.
Right.
I don't know if you heard about that.
This is patriots kicking Antifa out of their town. It's like, oh, is that what that is?
Yeah, and it's like they don't understand even what the word Antifa means, but lots of the time they get their news from somewhere else. Sure. And they don't get, you know, Antifa actually means anti-fascist, and either you're a Nazi or you're Antifa, and they don't get that, right? But everyone knows being called a Nazi is bad. It's at least what our history has told us, is being called a Nazi is bad. Yeah. So they know that. But I don't think they even get that term. So they throw that term around and they don't get it.
Right. So I wonder how much of this, obviously it's systemic. We can understand that big time, and it moves through generations. You know, people learn it. At what point does personal responsibility come into this discussion, and we stop blaming people in groups and we just start saying each person has a decision to make here? And it's really the fundamental decision of good and evil. You know, do we have to start holding people to a higher standard in every aspect of their life?
Oh, for sure. And I feel like people shouldn't be allowed to spew this hate and be online. I feel like they shouldn't have an online platform to spew hate. And I know people are probably going to say, well, freedom of speech, yada, yada, yada. You can say what you want, but you shouldn't be able to spew hate.
Right.
You shouldn't have hateful videos.
Right.
You shouldn't have pictures where, you know, your logos from Sons of Odin's or something, infidels. Like, that shouldn't be allowed.
Right. It's almost like, I don't know where we draw the line at hate speech. I don't know, but like...
That's the thing.
Sure.
There's a very, very thin line between what hate speech and freedom of expression. And I think that's where a lot of people are confused.
Sure.
Reporters, police officers, it's such a thin line, but experts have been calling for stronger hate speech laws.
Okay.
Because right now there is that thin line where it's, oh, that might be not against the law, but that person shouldn't say that. And like, lots of people don't understand what the laws are, what they can and can't say. So they just think, oh, I have freedom of expression. I can say whatever I want. Nobody.
Yeah. And so it's like, yeah, at what point is your expression really, okay, how about freedom of self-expression? Why don't you just keep it to yourself then? Because once you start to say things that you're expressing views about other people, that's, I think, where you start to go down. Like, I saw some really horrendous stuff from one of those guys talking about one of the activists. I mean, one of the Central Alberta white supremacist guys doing these YouTube rants about somebody else. It's like...
Yeah, I watched all those videos.
And we're better... Are we better for having seen that? I don't think so.
No, not at all. I remember it was like a joke with Rod and a couple of the reporters, because I'd be like, it's Friday night, you guys. I'm going down the rabbit hole.
Oh,
and
no.
I'm watching all these videos back to back. And it's like hour-long videos. And I'm just watching. I don't know why I was watching. Just... No, like they weren't even saying anything productive or intelligent, but I just couldn't stop.
Why?
And
why?
I don't know. There's just, for me, I think I've just always been a curious person. So I always just want to know why they're so ignorant. Like, why won't they listen to BIPOC people? So for me, I'm just always so curious. And I guess I don't really have an answer for you today about that.
I wouldn't really want to know.
I don't know.
Yeah.
But I think sometimes some people in that group, they do think they're the good guys. They think that they are standing up for our rights and our freedoms. And, you know, one of the things that they say a lot, actually, is they say, I don't see color. I can't be racist. Or I'm part Indigenous. Or I'm married to an Indigenous woman. Or I have a Black friend. I can't be racist. And like, that's what they say. And then they spew hate. And I feel like when they say, oh, I have a Black friend, or I'm part Indigenous, it's their way of being like, that's my proof I can't be racist. But it's not true. You can be racist 100% and still have people of color in your life. 100% you can still be racist. That doesn't just take it away.
Yeah, no, great point. And also, I would say the color blindness thing, I don't see color, like that's an inherently racist statement too.
Exactly. And that's why, and they don't know this, but that's another reason why it's like, okay, well, you don't see color. Okay, then that's exactly why you don't see why why these people are calling for racial equity, because you don't see their pain. You don't see their trauma. You don't see what they go through their entire life. You don't see that. And you won't accept it.
Well, yeah. You just assume it's the same as yours, which it's not. I want to use that word equity. I wanted to ask you about that. What does racial equity, as you understand it, what does that mean?
Every time I think of racial equity, okay, I'm going to throw it back to this picture that I saw online, and it's a picture of a kid two kids trying to look, I think they're watching a baseball game, but there's a fence in their way. So they're trying to,
Okay.
And one kid is tall. One kid's really tall, so he can see the game. He's having a great time. And the other kid is a bit shorter. So inequity means the shorter kid can't see the game at all, but they're standing right next to each other.
Sure.
Racial equality means that the kid is standing on some books.
Like an apple box or something.
An apple box, so they both can see the game. Racial equity means the fence isn't cut down a little bit, so they both can see.
Right. Equality is like they're all given the same size apple box, and the short kid still can't see.
Equality is you're giving people more opportunity kind of thing, and racial equity is changing the system to make it equal. I think that's how I interpret it.
Sure, no, I like
making it equal for everyone, because I used to say racial equality all the time, and then when I would be interviewing BIPOC people and many groups, they kept saying equity, and that's when I'm like, oh, okay. And I did a little bit more research, and so there is equality, and then there's equity, and lots of people are just calling for equity. They want to change the system. I think before it was let's help people who need help, and now it's like no, we want to go further, and we want to actually change the system so it's equal for every single person.
I see. That's useful then. So equality would be everybody gets the same apple box, and sometimes the short people still can't see.
Well, equality is the short people get the box.
Sure.
And the tall person doesn't get a box.
Gotcha.
So that's equality, right? So he doesn't need it, but you're giving a handout, or not. I won't say handout, but you're helping out people who need help. But
you're giving them what they need.
Equity is changing the system so that everyone has a fair chance of watching the baseball game.
And that's fundamentally it, right? It's like because of my race or my skin color, I don't necessarily need anything different given to me, but I need to be given the same opportunities.
Mm-hmm. Or the system needs to change.
Sure.
So that everyone...
To see me as equal.
So I will be treated like my white counterpart.
Right. Simple, really, in theory.
It sounds simple, but...
Well, because there's deeply held beliefs and implicit bias, if you will. People don't realize how they are furthering the system as it is. You know what I mean? Like, it's the systemic racism, sure, but it's the people inside the system who build out that racism.
Yeah.
In my view, anyway. I'm trying to be less opinionated, but if I say something that doesn't make sense, please call me on it.
Yeah, well, I think with like the word systemic racism, a lot of people think the system is full of racists. And that's not it. That's not true.
Okay.
It basically just means that it means that systemic racism stems from, institutions in power throughout history.
Right.
So it's racism that's been embedded in normal practices within all aspects of society, which continues to exclude one group while promoting the other.
Excluding one, promoting the other. Okay.
And lots of people who are in the system,
right.
I won't say lots, but some people who are in the system are not aware of what's happening, right? If it doesn't directly affect you, why would you be aware of it? Like, why would you care unless you seek out that information?
Right.
But if it's not directly impacting you,
why change?
Yeah. Why change, right?
It looks fine from where I'm standing, Mm-hmm. Do you have a sense of like what some metrics or some concrete ways that we could point to systemic racism and break it out of the system and say that's a racist act?
I think first, people who are part of these systems have to come out and they have to admit that their system is racist or there is systemic racism in there. And I know a lot of, RCMP have been saying that across the country. They've admitted, there is systemic racism within RCMP. Actually, a few months ago, sometime last spring, I think it was a year ago, Rod actually asked the Alberta RCMP, I'm blanking on his name, but he was an RCMP officer. I think he's the head of RCMP in Alberta.
Okay.
I'm not sure actually. But he asked him a great question. He asked him if he thinks the RCMP are systemic. There's systemic racism within RCMP. And the initial answer was no. A few days later, he backtracked and he admitted that there was systemic racism within the RCMP.
Thank God. At least you got to start somewhere.
You have to start somewhere, and it's good to admit it, because once you've admitted that means, okay, what can we work on? What needs to be done to try and fix this problem that we've had for hundreds of years?
So, okay, well, like they say, when you're addicted to something, admitting it is probably the first step, right?
It is, yeah.
In your travels as a journalist, in your coverage, have there been other places besides the police and RCMP where you've seen like blatant racism in action, like racism taking place on a policy, institutional level?
Well, when I was in Thunder Bay, I was there for 3 years.
Okay.
And one of the biggest stories that came out of Thunder Bay was this inquiry into the deaths of 7 Indigenous students who had come to Thunder Bay to study. They were elementary or high school students, and they came from different First Nations.
Okay.
To come to I wanted to say Edmonton, to come to Thunder Bay and study. And these 7 students, all of them died so tragically. Some died right next to the river. Some, I can't remember all, but lots of them died so tragically and so young. And a lot of advocates there were saying that police mishandled their deaths. And they were, citing systemic racism there because when, they're investigating, a high school Indigenous student who was missing, they feel like they're, from the very beginning of their investigation, they weren't taking it as seriously as they could, let's say, if it was a white student who went missing, or a white student who died, or who's found dead next to the lake.
The bay. So, okay. So that's hard to take. And so were you covering that story, or you were just around when it was?
I was covering the inquiry for a bit. It was a long time ago, so I can't really remember all the specific details, but I think that's when I was really first introduced to systemic racism in institutions.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, there's no easy answer, right? I'm not expecting anybody to have an answer in a 1-hour conversation, but I do appreciate your time, and you've enlightened me on a lot of things. So,
well, thank you for having me. I hope I didn't just ramble there for an hour.
No, you were good. You were but that's what it is. Like, you might come from a place like in journalism and media, news media, where it's like, it's got to be concise, right? It's got to be bam. But here's the time for you to ramble if you'd like to ramble.
Yeah. But I encourage you to seek, voices of people who are in the thick of it, who have experienced racism or who do experience overt racism every single day, because those people are, it's just listening to their stories, it will change the way you see things.
Which is kind of what I'm hoping for. And hopefully maybe in some way it could allow them to better understand what happened to them, and maybe we can get to some productive place of maybe trying to help, if that were possible. One more time on that documentary that's coming out Monday, where can we see it? So
the documentary airs this Monday, February 22nd, on City TV at 10 p.m. It's called VeraCity in Their Own Words.
Beautiful. Rachelle, I'm gonna watch it, and then I'm gonna talk to you about it. And I hope.
Yes, that'd be great.
Okay, right on. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.
You too. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to the North Bank Media Podcast. If you enjoy this conversation, please subscribe on YouTube and give us a like. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please subscribe as well and leave a 5-star review.